Welcome to Storymakers, the Storymakers podcast, a place where curiosity and play meet to spark faith through the imagination. I'm your host, Mel, and I will introduce you to new friends who will share hope for the kids and teens in your life, with a dose of encouragement for us grown-ups too. Let's get the party started. Hey, Storymakers, Mel here. I am super excited and pumped up for you guys to meet. I'm sure you guys already know Chad Bird, but Chad is on the Storymaker pod with us today. And Chad, we're so excited to have you. Thank you so much for joining Storymakers.
Of course, I'm glad to be here. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Well, Chad is an incredible writer. You have a history of being a pastor, all sorts of things. You're a grandfather. You're in Texas. You are a part of many networks. 1517 is one of them. But we always, we are dangerously curious about everyone that we meet. And we would love to share your story because, like we were just talking before the pod started, that the Bible stories don't just end with the characters in the book, but they are a continuation through our lives because we're all saints and we are Storymakers too, part of the Ultimate Storymaker, and we are image bearers. So Chad, we would love to hear about you and your story. Were you a kid of faith? Where did you grow up and how did you land as a writer?
Yeah, so I grew up in a wonderful family, Christian family. My mom and dad took us to church. It was just me and my sister. I have an older sister, so they took us to church. It felt like we were in church all the time. We'd go Sunday morning, Sunday evening, sometimes Wednesday. So definitely church was my second home when I was growing up. And of course, when you're a kid, you don't appreciate that as much. But looking back, I'm so grateful that my parents did that because so in my own life, I can't remember a time when I didn't have some familiarity with the biblical stories. I mean, I can remember as a very, very young kid, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 years old, being challenged to memorize something from the Bible. And so I've always been an overachiever. I memorized all of Genesis 1.
Oh my God.
So, but I can remember.
Candy, like our church would have VBS, like memorize this and you get a candy. And then it would just fall out of my brain. Like I got the Jolly Rancher and I was like, wait, what did I say?
Yeah. I guess I was destined even from a young age to fall in love with the Old Testament. So I loved all those stories and got to know kind of a surface level of everything from the Exodus to, Joshua and the Israelites marching around the city of Jericho, all those stories. That was part of my bloodstream, I guess you'd say, from the earliest age. So grew up in church. I served. I changed church traditions when I was about 18, 19 years old, but kept my intense love for the Bible. And then I went on to learn the original languages, Greek and Hebrew, so I could read it in the original. Served as a pastor for a while, professor of Hebrew for a while. But, I'm a scholar in residence for 1517, but I really like to say that I'm just someone who loves the Bible.
That's awesome.
I love to study the scriptures and love to teach and write about the scriptures because for me, it's like, not only are these just captivating stories that just suck you into the rhythm of the story and the characters, but behind them all is God, the true storyteller, the story maker himself. Yeah. So what's better than to be part of his story?
It's so cool. I mean, I love Capon talks about these stories being iconography in our minds, and we may not always know how they synthesize or why they're all there, but they belong there for some reason. And I think too, as you grow older and you get into the text, you think, oh, that's why that's there for this moment. Now I sort of have that integrated or can understand that. And we love the Old Testament really hardcore here in Storymaker world because I think it's it is so captivating. Rahab, I mean, there's so many wild tales that just, how can they not capture your imagination? But the social emotional component to these stories too are so I think you can just really connect to them when we're talking about Joseph and the brothers and jealousy and all the feels. They just come into play in the text. So Chad, I think for so many of us, and those of us who maybe struggle with like getting into the text or falling in love with it, I think there's probably some sort of wall between connecting emotionally to the stories. And what do you think that is that keeps people from sort of having this curiosity or feeling like, oh, this has relevance in my life?
Yeah, one of the things I always love to stress when I'm talking to people about this is that there was a change that took place in the way that I read the Bible. So for the longest time, I read the Bible as if I couldn't smile. This is very serious. I'm reading the Bible. So there's no joking. There's no, this is an important thing. And then actually in my own life, I studied with Jews for a while. I went to Hebrew Union College and studied with Jewish students and Jewish professors. And they taught me to have fun reading the scriptures and to laugh, to smile, and to find the humorous things as well as the sad things in the Bible. Yeah. Now, the reason I begin to answer your question that way is because what happened with me is I began to really understand. I mean, I knew this intellectually, but I began to really grasp the fact that these are real people I'm reading about. If you would have asked me, Chad, are these like real people? Like Joseph was a real person? I said, of course. But that really wasn't the way I was reading the scriptures. So I began to see, okay, these are real people with real personalities, just like you, just like me, just like all of us today. And so you get to know them. You get to know their personalities. What are their strengths? What are the weaknesses? Are they funny? Are they serious? Or are they kind of just a goofball? Are they sarcastic? Because you find all of these in biblical characters. And I think the more that you realize that these are real people and you get to know them and you interpret them just like we interpret people still today, then all of a sudden you enter their stories more fully. Because, I mean, just think about it. You have people in your life that you've entered into their story. They've entered into yours. Well, we can do the same thing with these folks in the Bible. We enter into their stories and we begin to see, oh man, okay, so 3,000 years separate me from him or her, but this could be my next door neighbor.
Yeah.
This could be my spouse or my brother or my sister or my friend, because these people are like we still are today. So you really get to know yourself through knowing these characters. And then, of course, most importantly, you get to know the God of these people who still are God today. So anyway, that's one way I try and get people to kind of break.
I think that's a really great point. I mean, I sort of read it in such high reverence and like at a distance until I think my husband went to seminary and we were in Pittsburgh, and I felt that kind of a detachment. They have to become real. And they were also, I think I was taught in a way with Sunday school that these were almost like godlike figures, like David was untouchable. I mean, they just, you were just given snippets of stories, so you didn't know too much about them. You didn't know that they were failures.
Yeah.
But I think that's super helpful. I always think of Aaron. I always feel so bad for him in the calf scene. I just think like, I'm so overwhelmed. Everyone was yelling at me. I didn't know what to do. I just was like, go ahead and make that thing. That's how I sort of think of that character. But I think that's so true. The biblical lens, I think, is so important, and having a framework in how we navigate scripture. And I think, Chad, for those who feel challenged to say, like, how do I teach my kids or integrate like what's happening in the Old Testament with the New Testament? I think people feel very challenged about integrating that point of view, or how those stories, are they woven together? Is that Old Testament God, New Testament God? I think those are also places where people get tripped up and then they just don't engage. They're like, I don't know about that. I'm just not going to even start.
Oh yeah, you'll even hear people talk about, well, I'm a New Testament Christian instead of an Old Testament Christian. And I understand where they're coming from, but I always say, well, think about it this way. What Bible did Jesus read? What Bible did Jesus? And his earliest followers read and teach from and write on the basis of was what we call the Old Testament. They just called it the Bible. There was no Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. There was no Acts or Paul's letter to the Romans. So when they're studying the Bible, they're studying what we call the Old Testament, and they saw in it everything. The examples of faith, the examples of sin, the examples of forgiveness and reconciliation, and all of Christ's work was portrayed beforehand in the Old Testament as well. And the more that you kind of get that, you're like, oh, so this Old Testament is actually about Jesus. It's a Christian collection of writings. Then, I mean, once you understand that, everything else kind of begins to fall in place. And yeah, I mean, there's certainly differences between the Old Testament characters and the New Testament. But what are they doing? They're relying on God's promises. What are they trying to do? Well, many of them are trying to live up to God's law. Many of them are not, but they're all breaking it one way or another. So you realize, yeah, they're all failures. They're all sinners in need of grace. And so then you realize, well, this is not just an Old Testament. It's ever new, because it's always speaking to us of who we are and how we've fallen short and what we can hope, what our hope is based on, and how God is for us in Jesus Christ. So there's all sorts of integration between the Old and New Testament. But what helped me, at least initially, was to realize that if you went to church, let's say, 10 years after Jesus ascended into heaven, and you were studying the Bible, it would have been the Old Testament. This was the scriptures for them. So once you kind of get that, everything else falls into place.
Well, and I think, yeah, what would you say, Chad, about like the role of curiosity throughout the Old Testament? I think that's one thing we tell parents, like, get really curious, or youth and family people, as you explore the scriptures, because I think, when people think about, I'm a New Testament Christian, they're really clinging to the redemptive piece of the New Testament. And it exists in the Old Testament. So when we're curious, those are discoverable places. And you can see the nature of God moving it towards the New Testament. They're not different. It's not a different thing. Yeah. So what would you say, Chad, about like curiosity and how that plays?
Yeah. So one of the things I love to do when I'm reading the Bible, whether it's prophets or Psalms or narrative, just ask yourself questions. So, why did God set things up this way? An example, why in the world would God require, this gets a lot of people, why all the gross animal sacrifice? I can't read Leviticus. That's just blood everywhere.
Yeah.
Well, so ask yourself, why did God set things up that way? Well, maybe when your curiosity kicks in and you think about that, you're like, well, maybe he was teaching us that sinners aren't forgiven because of a sacrifice they make or blood they shed. They're forgiven because another is sacrificed in their place. And that curious question then leads to a realization that, so Leviticus is already teaching us about the God who provides a substitute on our behalf by which we receive forgiveness. And all of a sudden, the whole thing opens up as a book that teaches us about Jesus and his sacrifice for us. But then you also get to stories. You're reading about Joseph, and you're like, so what was Joseph like as a young man? Because he comes across as kind of a spoiled know-it-all, honestly. So here's how curiosity helped me recently. I was like, Joseph sure seems to talk a lot. I wonder who talked the most in Genesis. And so I did a study. Guess who talks the most in Genesis?
Who?
Besides God? Joseph. He's like, I figured it was like Jacob, because Jacob, never misses a chance to talk.
Yeah.
No, it's actually his son Joseph. He talks more than any other character in Genesis besides God. So he likes to hear his voice.
Here. That's going to drop in socials.
Yeah. So Joseph, he loves to hear himself talk. Sometimes he'll, like when Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him, even then he doesn't just say no and leaves the room. He's got to make this whole sermon. So,
let me hear your speech.
Yeah, no, and let me explain why. Okay, you just need to say no and leave. So, yeah, but that's just one example of how curiosity can lead you to new discoveries about God, about Christ, about the characters, and ultimately about who we are. Also.
Yeah, that's so cool. Listeners, Chad dropped a book Hitchhiking with Prophets, and I definitely listened and read it. So excited. We just wrote Jonah and the Miners, and it was so helpful for me because, we're like, well, what do we do about Obadiah? There's and all these things all matter. They're there for a reason. And so as you were creating and writing, I know there's a synergy in the process of study, and I'm sure you're very prayerful in this process. There's also a creativity in sort of piecing together the narrative around any book that you're writing. But so in particular with Hitchhiking with Prophets, what was that like for you, Chad?
It was such a challenge, a good challenge in so many ways. First of all, let's take what I've studied for the last 3 decades and compress it into a very small book. Okay, no challenge there. And then apart from that, you're telling this big story, the Old Testament, right? And you're gonna tell it in, let's see, about 160 pages.
I mean, Isaiah alone.
I know. So part of the challenge was, okay, I can't tell everything. I got to leave some parts out, and I definitely have to include some sections. So that was a challenge. But also just how do you tell the story? I wanted this to be not kind of a factual history of this happened and this happened and this happened. Where you can find, there's thousands of books out there that do that. Yeah. I wanted this to be a creative and a fun, and at times even a lighthearted retelling of that salvation story. Mm-hmm. So that's why I structured it the way I did. So it's called Hitchhiking with Prophets, because every chapter begins where somebody pulls up, maybe it's David, maybe it's Abraham, maybe it's Moses, and you have a little description of where they're at and what they look like, or whatever it might be. And you ride shotgun with them. So you get into the passenger seat. So you're journeying through the Old Testament, and you're hitchhiking your way along with patriarchs and prophets and psalmists and everybody else. So that's the way I told the story. And the idea is the farther along you get, you're getting closer and closer to really the driver that you've been waiting for. And that's how the book ends, where Jesus steps into the driver's seat. And the one we've been waiting on that whole time has now shown up.
Well, I just loved it. I mean, I think, there's so much value to scholarship and academia and deep study. I think it's also such a ministry and a gift if you can take all of that high level thinking and history and make it digestible and accessible to people who are not likely to get into the prophets,
yeah.
or any of these texts that are not, it's like Leviticus, like yes. who's thinking I'm going to do that for leisure. But I think I'm thinking a lot about we think a lot about parents, especially millennials, who are noted as the most biblically illiterate generation of our time. Sorry, guys. But these are the kinds of resources I think that are really important for grownups who want to engage in faith at home and want to spark biblical literacy, and maybe they don't have it for themselves. But this is, I think, storytelling, embodiment of story is just such a gift and a great way to have an access point, entry point to these stories. So cool. Thank you, Chad. That was, I loved it. I listened to it and then I read it too.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.
So cool. Well, we're deeply curious, and I know that so much of the work that you do is really incredibly theological, and you've studied and done all these wonderful things. One of the things I love also about your work is that it's so creative and melodic, and I love the tone of your writing. And so we would just love to know, who has captured your imagination in that creative space? And who are you inspired by?
Oh yeah, I don't even know where to start. So I think, so this isn't poetry. This is prose, and it might come across as a surprise to some people who know my books. But I was deeply influenced as a kid by reading Western novels. So my dad I was raised as a cowboy. I could ride a horse before I could ride a bicycle, and my dad had all these Louis L'Amour novels. Is famous Western writer.
Yeah.
And so I grew up reading those, and one of the things I guess I picked up from him is there can be a poetry in prose in the sense of, what does poetry like to do? Poetry uses a lot of very colorful graphic language, a lot of hyperbole. And you find some of that in Lamore's writings. And somewhere along the way, and I can't tell you when this was, it was probably unconscious on my part, but I realized that I want people to be able to see what I'm writing. In other words, I don't want to use just kind of abstract language. I want to use colorful language, visual language, metaphors and similes and things like that you can actually see as you're reading along. So I picked that up from not only Lou L'Amour, but from a lot of other people as well, to help people to actually envision something. So they're not just kind of reading a book. They're, to use a term you used earlier, iconography. It's almost like the writing becomes iconography. You're painting this entire picture for people to see. So a lot of the early authors that I read, not just Louis L'Amour, but a lot of classical writers as well. I love Dostoevsky. I love 19th century British authors like Dickens. I've always just devoured books. So my influences come from a lot of different directions. I'm currently reading Dante's Divine Comedy.
I saw that.
So yeah, and loving that. I tell my wife I'm embarrassed that I'm the age I am, but I've never read this because it's like a classic of Christian literature.
Well, my kids are both reading it right now, and they're in high school.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. It was like always on the stack, but I just never got around to it, and I'm loving it. Of course, this is poetry, a very unique sort of poetry, in its rhythmic pattern. But I'm loving the story he tells. And then it's not just about, a visit to hell and purgatory and heaven, but it's an interior journey in which not just Dante, but the reader is drawn into the story of who we are and what we need to see and confront and confess. So, I mean, I'm a lifelong student. I continue to learn and continue to be influenced by the people that I read. So I'm trying to imitate the best and to borrow from the best in order that in my own writing, I can try and achieve at least partially what great writers have achieved in the past.
Well, I think it's so key to the whole thing, especially, I mean, we're always thinking about, like talk about like making something accessible that's huge to, for small people. So we're in that space of storytelling all the time. Like, how do you make Isaiah accessible to 4th and 5th graders? You need to really paint a picture, and the picture exists and it's there. But it's, knowing. And I think that's what literature helps us be able to do, because it's like, oh, well, that really helped me picture what they're communicating. And I'm going to use that device in the way in which I write, or the way in which I'm trying to connect to. And, it's like Jesus always painted pictures and told stories. And so, it's just like, oh, we can go with that.
Yeah. That's a pretty good example to follow.
Yeah. It's like, you got some really great parables. So I think that's so key. And grownups out there, parents out there, I think, stealing a moment away, as one of our other friends, Heritage Mom, said, she talks about stealing a moment in literature is so good for your kids. I think the same is true for our own faith journey through the books of the Bible, right? When you're reading Dickinson's, you're like, oh, he has connects to the Bible. Shakespeare connect to the Bible. There are all of these hooks interfacing with each other, and so we're all talking to each other because we're image bearers, and it's so fun to see where those places land.
Oh yeah. I mean, you look at the rest of literature. What are they doing? They're building upon archetypes. Whatever that archetype might be, whether it's a hero story or a struggle story, well, that's all in the Bible. I mean, all the great literature is basically we're stealing from the biblical story, and we see, and we're living it too. I mean, our lives reflect so many of these archetypical stories too. So, yeah, we're not trapped, but we're glad to be in this whole web of interconnections through story. Your story, mine, the biblical story, the stories we read about, we're all part of this vast story that God is still telling. as he continues to write. And you and I, we're one chapter in this long world story, but an important chapter.
Yeah.
The story would be incomplete without us and without everybody who's watching or listening to this. All our stories count because they're all part of God's weaving this story together, which began in creation and will culminate when Christ returns again, where we'll enter into the next part of the story.
That's so cool. Well, one thing, Chad, I feel that sometimes people feel stumped about is being able to balance out like the role of the law and the gospel when they are reading the text. And so sometimes people feel confused by it, or they feel like, are these things contradicting each other? Does the Bible contradict itself? And I know that you've written so many things, and you also have lots of podcasts. Is there a resource or a space that you would say, if you're struggling with that particular if that's a wall, if that's something that's hard for you to get to figure out, these are a couple good places to start.
Yeah, well, especially with law gospel, you mean? Is that?
Yeah, I think that sometimes people feel confused when they've never like gotten into the text, or they're getting into the text and they're thinking like, well, that seems like a rule. Like where does it all fit together? Like, does this fit together? This feels a little crunchy.
Yeah. So I don't want to just self-promote here, but one of
I'm just telling you guys, you're really poetic and really accessible. So if you wanna, I love the Bible, and it opened up for me in so many ways. But it took some like theological framework and gymnastics to get there. So let's help our friends.
Yeah. So our podcast, 40 Minutes in the Old Testament, we basically approach the whole Old Testament with this law gospel perspective. So we've been doing this for 10 years now, slowly inching our way through the Old Testament. But I think that would be helpful for people, because we're always asking those questions. Dan, my co-host, and I, we're like, okay, what is this teaching us about the law, or how's God using this story to teach us about grace? And besides that, we're just saying, okay, what does the story mean? Or what's this part of Leviticus actually trying to teach us? So that might be an entry point for people who are, curious about one particular chapter or a whole book, or maybe they just want to start with episode 1 and listen all the way to episode 450 or we have.
Well, that is so great. I mean, I love the interwebs for this reason. I forgot about that. It's like, if you're tripped up in Kings or Judges, you can go into the pod and you can just, it's like, I want to, like, what's the deal with Judges? You can also buy it in Storymakers, get the kids version, because that's really easy too. But the pod is also really awesome. That's super helpful. Well, Chad, we talk a lot about how God's story is a long, long story. And I just know, as I've grown into adulthood and midlife, looking back at my life, I can see these really interesting and fun moments where I was like, oh, that's what God was doing to land me here in this creative space. Chad, can you look back at your life and say like, oh, that's why that happened? Or I went to like a creative elementary school for the first 3 years of my life. And that's like forms so much of how I do so much of my life. And, God's like, beep, beep. Do you have any of those fun kinds of moments, Chad, that you look back on and you're like, okay.
Oh yeah. And like my mind is racing now, because I've got about 20 that are bouncing around in my head right now. So let me give you my answer, but can I preface it with this little biblical story? So I love this. So Jacob is leaving. He's going into exile because he's tricked his dad, and his brothers wants to kill him. And he leaves. And right before he leaves where they live, we're told this is when you have the whole angels coming up and down the stairway. But if you look in Genesis, it says, and he came to not a place, he comes to the place. And there he stopped and he camped. And I've always thought that's interesting, because how much of our lives, and Jacob didn't realize it was the place. He thought it was a place. How much of our lives do we come to a place that's actually the place? We think it's a place, but actually going to be the place. We think it's a conversation. It's going to be the conversation. We think we're meeting a person. It's going to be the person. So God works with the, and we work with the A. And sometimes it's only later that we realize, oh, that's what God was doing. I mean, I'll just give you one easy example. So about 10 years ago, 10 and a half years ago, I received a Facebook message from a guy I didn't know. His name's Dan. And I had no clue who this guy was, but he just wanted to have a conversation. And I would usually just kind of brush that aside and be like, I don't know this dude. I'm not gonna have a conversation with him.
Yeah.
You know, but I thought, whatever it was, I thought, okay, I guess I will. So I wrote him back, gave him my phone number. He called that night, and we spent 3 hours on the phone.
Wow.
And that was the beginning of my friendship with Daniel Emery Price, who's now not only one of my great friends, but my brother in Christ and a coworker. And it was that conversation that opened up opportunities for me to get out of a really bad place that I was in and be able actually to begin to use a lot of the gifts that I had, but that I had just kind of shoved in the closet and closed the door. So it all began with just a Facebook message and then a phone conversation. And now here I am over 10 years later, great friends with him, colleagues, and been able to do now what I love, what I'm passionate about. So I thought it was just a conversation. Turns out it was actually the conversation.
Yeah. Well, I love that, especially, because you're such a gifted writer. It's such a gift for the rest of us, and I think that, especially I think in the theological space, because it can feel so, because I'm such a lay person, and I think, the majority of us are lay people. So having an entry point and access to the goods in a way that feels inviting and makes you feel like, oh, I'm a part of the thing. I'm not being spoken at, but I'm part of this conversation too, and I'm invited into it. And so I think that that's the melody and the writing style that you bring to the readers. So we're super grateful for that, and I'm glad Dan called you, and I'm glad you picked up.
Me too.
I'm so sus of anyone on the internet, so I'm like,
yeah.
But that's so wonderful. Well, Chad, thank you so much for being with us today. And if you're interested in the prophets, check out Chad. You can find him on IG and all the wonderful places just to be encouraged. And if you want to read a melody about our Creator, check out any of Chad's work. So it's so wonderful to have you. Thank you, Chad.
Thank you, Mel.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Today's episode of the Storymakers podcast was made possible by donors and produced by Mockingbird Ministries. Listen to more episodes and join the adventure at storymakersnyc.com or follow us along on Instagram. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget, share the show with a friend or maybe two, and use the code SMPodcast10 for 10% off your next order. Catch you next time.